Hi, I'm Diane Lagrange. Welcome to Popular Frequencies for a new episode of Le Monde, according to Todd. Hello, Emmanuel Todd.
Hello, Diane.
Hope you had a nice summer.
I wouldn't say that, but that's okay. It's over. That's the main thing.
Well, first of all, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, put a thumbs up, comment for referencing, and not to miss any new episodes. It was a very hectic summer, so maybe for you, but in any case, for the country.
It is one of the dimension of the bad summer was that there were so many things to follow, so inconsistent that it ruined my intellectual opinion.
That's right. It's that we didn't get the usual summer break when there's no news, etc. No. And so it was very hectic, a fairly explosive back to work. However, we can see that everything you announced in the defeat of the West, but also in the class struggles in France in the 21st century, is gradually coming true. Your reputation as a prophet is increasingly being confirmed.
I will make a point of saying what I was wrong about during the discussion.
Okay, fine, we'll get back to it. Perhaps we will start with the situation in France before talking about the international situation. As a reminder, France's finances are in a worrying state, and Mr. Bayrou announced, our former Prime Minister announced on July 15, a budget providing for almost 44 billion in savings with the abolition of 2 uncompensated public holidays, a blank year with a freeze on social benefits, a doubling of the medical franchise and the elimination of civil service posts, and no replacement of 1 out of 3 in the public service additional spending. In terms of arms, almost at the same time as a report was released estimating that $211 billion per year was being spent on various forms of aid to businesses, including reductions in contributions, etc. There has been a lot of anti-tax protests on social media this summer, including acrimony towards retirees with the Nicholas Who Pays movement, which was then taken up by Bayrou, who pointed a few pensioners to popular vindictiveness. We also saw a lot of results on the left with the bloc movement in all, who has mobilized for as of September 10, then September 18. For unions, Bayrou proposed a vote of confidence on September 8, perhaps to diffuse these movements, but he lost by a wide margin, leading to his resignation and the appointment of Sébastien Lecornu, who was therefore a 5th Prime Minister in 3 years. Many are calling for Macron to resign. We have seen polls with 64% of French people calling for the departure of Emmanuel Macron, while if there was a dissolution, it would apparently lead to a new stalled assembly. Honest advantage of the hour in this time, so it's political crisis. And the mobilizations are starting again with the days of action that we saw on the 10th and 18th, which are supported by the majority of the population, but perhaps with a wait-and-see perspective. And France also lost its second by the credit rating agency Fitch. So much for the summary of the situation. What is your opinion after this summer?
Just to say, there are 2 things. First, there is an internal dynamic in French society. And me, what interested me the most, the rest I heard yesterday in the report of the trade union demonstration, it is the emergence of this desire to make the rich pay. And an egalitarian demand, in fact. And I won't comment on effectiveness or non-effectiveness. So it's the Zoukman tax. There it is, that's it. But the emergence of this theme in France, specifically, and I think it is very important, because in fact, the crisis of one type or another is affecting all major European companies now. I mean, in England, there was this, yes, it is very specific to France. In fact, we're all. The truth that must be said right away is that there are problems, specific issues related to neoliberal policies and to European integration. But there is also the enormous pressure to choose war with Russia. In fact, sanctions against Russia. The second sets of sanctions. These sanctions that have reinvigorated and reoriented the Russian economy and are destroying all European economies. And so, in fact, it's tricky everywhere. So in England, the latest news was this massive protest of 400,000 people When you know England, English people don't demonstrate in principle. It is exceptional. It happens, but it's exceptional. In Germany, there is a huge push from the AfD, the party. I don't use the words. Populist, far right, nationalist. I prefer to talk about popular party, in fact, because they are parties that are rooted in popular circles. It's right-wing popular or really popular. And so, in fact, the Swedish economy is in bad shape. Well, it actually cracks. In fact, what was funny, by the way, was that funny might not be the word, but it was that Westerners' obsession was with. They had this regime change thing. The objective, therefore, is regime change in Russia change. There you go. Regime change in Iran is not working. On the other hand, the Russians, I think, are on the verge of getting regime changes, in Western Europe. Whether it's the explosion of the European Union, the blockage of the French political system before the explosion.
At the moment, there's no real regime change. We are changing the prime minister, yes, but we are not at the end.
But what I find interesting is to come back to France, because I don't have to, anyway, I mainly do geopolitics, but I am a French citizen and I am interested in what is happening at home. And it is that in the French case, we can see the rise. So there are these popular right-wing forces everywhere, all of which have a fundamental anti-immigration dimension. It's really like a given. But in France, in addition, there is this anti-rich dimension. That is to say, there is no such thing in Germany, as far as I know. There is no such thing in England. It's as if French working class circles, and that is not only popular groups in the CFDT and CGT movements. The National Rally is also affected by this. It is as if there is a tension between the immigration issue and the question of the rich. In other words, it is as if working class communities in a state of stress, identity or not, were torn between two scapegoats. Are we going to beat up immigrants, or are we going to beat up the rich?
Instead, Beru may try to designate retirees. That's another scapegoat.
Oh, that's another one. Maybe I feel targeted. It's the same age as Byrie. Romain Lanchon, it is the generation that must disappear. What struck me the most about the French events, it's in terms of analyzing sensitivities, behaviors, this theme of making the rich pay, which weighs very heavily. It weighs very heavily, not only on the left, on socialists, as we may be inclined to believe, but in fact who weighs on the National Rally, which is redeveloping its oligarchic discourse, which will never dare to deprive itself of its anti-immigrant business, but which feels that its electorate, I believe that 50% of the workers are voting for the National Rally now, than in the last legislative elections. It's because it's taking a risk.
We saw a survey that 2% tax on wealth income is approved by 86% of the population.
For me, it makes me laugh because I experienced all the debates on the French revolutionary tradition. So I saw all the people coming from the second left of the confessionalized Catholicism, the CFDT. I saw people that I like, or many, François Fourreau, a historian, who passed away, unfortunately, or Pierre Rossin-Vallon. I have seen a good part of their lives campaigning on the theme, the French Revolution is over. Well, in fact, it feels like the French Revolution is not over. Well, when you read the English press, there are always theoretical references to the concept of yellow jacket, the yellow vest, since France is the country that made the yellow vest in a very recent phase with this threat. And so you can feel this tension, and that's what I find the most interesting. With regard to blocking, The debates, the details of the debates. I have a bit of trouble getting into it because we're in a world where everyone is pretending, since the fundamental problem of France is that it no longer can have an economic policy.
Blocked by the structure.
France is a country that no longer has sovereignty. So we don't have monetary sovereignty. We don't have commercial sovereignty. And so the government cannot produce solutions to internal imbalances and cannot talk a little about taxation when it should be talking about freeing itself from European constraints and providing production which unfortunately is just not possible right now in the current context. I'm honestly embarrassed to say it, truly, because I would really like to come across as a peaceful father, to come across as the old-fashioned, moderate, reasonable type, full of quiet wisdom and all that, you name it, falls in at this point. I believe the only two reasonable things, which I only think of as a solution to debt problems, is the political system's blocked. And I wondered, moreover, if this blockage is not trying to move towards this solution. The default on the debt. The default, something very egalitarian by definition, since the people who own the debt are the rich. That's why I think the rich have an interest in negotiating seriously, rather than to make concessions. Because if they don't make concessions, what threatens them is default and liquidation.
And it's largely owned overseas, in fact.
Too bad for abroad. The system is exploding. If France slams on this level, the European Union is slamming, the system is slamming, that's all. So default on debt. But if you don't arrive at a debt default in a serene manner, as a peaceful father, retired, the only solution seems to me regime change for France. That is to say, not a revolution, but something. So talk in detail about the debates between the parties, and they're all pretending. That is to say that the right is pretending. Well, what do they call? How do they call that? The thing in the center right now, who are actually extremists, the Macronists and company.
Yes,
finally, the central bloc.
the central bloc.
The central bloc that is actual.
The majority, the presidential minority.
The central bloc, which is in fact the extremist trend of French politics. But the left is pretending, the PS is pretending, the LFI is pretending, the National Rally is pretending, since nobody anymore. And that's true of the electorate as well. The electorate is also pretending. Nobody dares to say no as long as we are in the euro. There was a false question. So, all the same, what is interesting is that Parliament is there. Nevertheless, Bayrou may be a revolutionary agent without his free will. That's because by creating a story about the debt emergency, he really focused on this fundamental problem that is the root cause of debt. And the origin of debt is in fact the euro. In other words, the euro made it possible to borrow at very low interest rates. If we had the franc, we would have been responsible for ourselves, and we would have devalued, and we would have been brought to our senses by the devaluation. We would have remained in the normal universe of the dynamic France of the Fourth and the beginning of the Fifth Republic, but the euro allowed us to live on credit, and that's it. My personal opinion on the subject is not very interesting to me. I have the impression of rambling when I say that. Since no one believes it anymore, I feel like I'm saying I've already used that to say, yes, I'm sorry, but now you're talking about stuff. But I'm reminding you that this patient basically needs a heart bypass, and that as long as we don't do it, we're at the end of it.
Putting a band-aid on a bullet wound.
Exactly. Basically, this kind of thing. But on the other hand, what I'm interested in is that now, quite independently of me, the problem came up, and I read a book by Didier Cahan, a book pre-written by Jacques Delarosière called The Euro in Danger, in which it is clear what I have just said. That is to say that it is the euro that is in fact responsible for this low-cost debt mechanism that has put France in this situation entirely. That's the funny thing since the euro.
It was already an analysis, for example, of the Greek crisis by Stiglitz or by...
Yes, but of course, but for us it's a bit different because France is one of the founding countries and one of the two important countries in the creation of the euro with Germany. And until then, the Germans let us do a bit of what we wanted. So they gave us some peace of mind, they let us get into debt. Because while France keeps quiet, Germany controls Europe through its financial power. Especially since the crisis of 2007, 2008. So we bashed the Greeks and all that, etc. And French, we let them be. It's perverse, actually. We let them do whatever they want, not fix their public accounts, not dealing with real economic and industrial balances. In short, we let the French destroy themselves by letting them get into debt without even thinking about it. So it's the return of the...
Perhaps there was also the fact that French industries, French energy were also being attacked from Germany, and that it was also convenient for them because as a result, they had industries that exported.
Yes, well, I think that. There was competition as well. Yes, absolutely, since the euro. And that was changed. It was undervalued for Germany, overvalued for France. He forced to do his part to help businesses. Aid to businesses is also because the euro was too strong. And I think that one of the French mistakes is the Germans actually play it because we have a vision. The Germans are thought to be heavy. They are not subtle people like us. It's just not true. It's just not true, Germans. Germany, a huge culture, is full of smart people. And they have a very subtle policy of controlling Europe. But now, we feel that we menaced, we're moving towards something else. I don't know how to say it. We're moving towards something else. But the hard part about, I think, what ruined my summer vacation, who I knew we were going to be conducting our interview today, it is that, of course, we must take stock at the end of the summer per usual, but it's just that right now we are basically right before right before the last judgment. It's like, well, now is the time. Now we can basically, if need be, jump to self-administering extreme unction already. But we're not there yet. It's true. For the English crisis. Starmer is always there with his latest. What I like about Starmer is that he's one of the few who really looks stupid. It's true that when I see him, I say to myself, he's stupid.
That's not very nice.
It's not very nice. And it's an Anglophile telling you that. So Merz, when I see him, I think to myself, he seems crazy. It is something else. There you go. In France, there's no one left because, in fact, they're all pretending to exist. So now I want to know who is minister of what. It hasn't changed yet. There it is. It does not matter. How to say the system is stuck. But we are not at the end. And then there's even on this. So we are at unction by extreme unction. But we're not there yet. We're not there yet. And when you look at yesterday's demonstration that I watched on the 24/7 news channels, so I felt that the journalists were quite disappointed in the absence of violence.
It was a journalist who was injured by a grenade thrown by the police.
There you go. I really felt that people were very disappointed that the French demonstrators were behaving well. But it was. And for me, my heart is on the side of the demonstrators. I can't help myself. It's impulsive. I'm for the yellow vests. I'm for the guys who demonstrate with the CGT. Even if I can't stand Sophie Binet. There you go. Good. But what struck me was the completely offbeat aspect of this demonstration in relation to the European or global context. In other words, we were in the world before. It was a demonstration from before where we are here discussing things apart from the emergence of egalitarian themes, making the rich pay. Good.
Personally, I would like to come back to this theme because precisely, yes, excuse me.
To finish something is to say that we are just before the thing. And this central phenomenon that is the war in Ukraine, which we will obviously talk about again, and which is more my subject, in fact, here too. We are almost at the conclusion, but not quite. And so here too, we are just before we find this problem of extreme anointing, but it is not over. And so it's a really difficult time to do analysis. So we can speculate, discuss leads, but it's difficult.
Yes, we can feel it cracking, but we don't know exactly.
I am a historian of the long term. So my first instinct is this. It would be pending the final result to go and resume my research on the Bronze Age, since there's a moment of pause. And then once European regimes collapse, Ukraine collapses, that Russia will always be standing as if nothing had happened. Now, I would say I could do my number. Told you so.
And we're going to need recipes from the Bronze Age.
And above all, the Bronze Age mud and the collapse of the Bronze Age. That's because the lessons to be learned. It was the first globalization. Because you see, there were Bronze Age principalities located in what is now Denmark. And there were also Bronze Age mines located in the region of Western Siberia. It was driven by Mesopotamian cities. It was the first globalization of the Bronze Age, and it fell apart. It's going to be full of lessons.
Oh yes, we are waiting impatiently. For me, I just wanted to highlight the class struggle in France in the 21st century. So maybe that has changed since Macron, because that was at the time. But you were not so much pointing to the increase in inequalities as to the fact that the standard of living of French people in general was falling. The country is completely falling behind. More than the explosion of inequalities.
There, the drop in the standard of living, we have it. INSEE continues to not do its job. There's nothing you can do with these lousy price indexes. I'm telling you, if I were President of the Republic, which is just a matter of time, of course, the first thing I would do is a purge of INSEE. I would purge it of bureaucratic savagery, defying imagination, I'm telling you. But still, they have the NC1 newsletter in July with it to come back to the idea. Things about the rise in inequalities anyway, that's it, here we are. In other words, the top decile, the top 10% have rising incomes, while the bottom decile have falling incomes. So in addition to the general decline in living standards, which they refuse to measure accurately, there is also a rise in inequality, and this obviously contributes to the problem, to this revival of the issue of social equality in relation to immigration. I'm not at all saying that the immigration issue is not important and legitimate. Personally, I am always quite shocked when people qualify the say, well, you see, I'm a son-in-law man, but I'm still shocked of all the names we give to these parties in Europe. Say, extreme right. The other day I saw a paper from Le Figaro, an excellent newspaper, by the way, in truth, much superior to the Monde nowadays, which talks about the National Rally as a party that is nationalist. But in a certain sense, all historical references to the pre-war period are absurd. So not just because the fundamental basis of all these so-called far-right parties, and which I call popular right-wing parties, in fact, it's the working classes, it's the workers, the employees, it's the people who didn't study, and that the European extreme right was the petty bourgeoisie, and that on the contrary, the proletariat instead resisted the extreme right. And above all, the extreme right of the nationalist parties of the pre-war period were nevertheless in a logic of territorial expansion and aggression against the neighbor. Whereas now, on the contrary, we are on A. Yeah, you like it or you don't like it, but it's a defensive move of people who say, I want to be quiet at home. So we can consider that it is not a noble objective, and that we must all be in a global community of mixed cultures, honestly describe an attitude, even if it is considered to be a bit narrow. Seen from the top of French society, one would think, oh, come on, preventing people from coming to us is not classy. It just has nothing to do with far-right stuff. But the fundamental thing is that in France itself, it works, it exists. Anti-Arab feelings in the working class, anti-Islam among the middle classes, all of this exists, but there is still this rise, this resurgence of an egalitarian, anti-rich, anti-elite feeling, this French culture that we cannot manage to eradicate. It makes me feel good.
You quoted an article by Jean Fouquet on the inextricable situation we find ourselves in at the moment, with the center collapsing on the two wings of LFI and RN, with new fault lines between the traditional left-right positions, and above all, perhaps most significantly, the widespread rejection of politics as a whole by large segments of the population. What he saw in the polls was, in fact, that all policies in general are being booed. There are also politicians attempting to make a comeback. He compares them to Gollum from The Lord of the Rings, obsessed with power, with the ring, unable to resist its pull, and ultimately incapable of letting go, no matter the cost. What does this tripartition inspire you?
I find this what is very powerful in the Pockier's law interview is that he does not simply analyze the political system's deadlock. In fact, he attributes his deadlock to the fragmentation of French society itself, which is something much broader. They used to say he doesn't just see political blocks, he sees social blocks. It's his theory of the French archipelago. In fact, it's a fragmented society. So I can only agree with that. We know each other very well with 4K. We have agreements, a lot of agreements. Personally, I would connect. How to say, it's an analysis of this kind of model, so making a special site for old Fartier, which refers to his anterior work, is that from books called The Economic Legions, which I had to publish in the second half of the 90s. So that the second half of the 90s. I fear that saw that there was a new fragmentation of French society that was linked to the development of higher education. That is to say, the democracy functioning, political parties functioning, that was everything. Everybody knows how to read and write. and very few people make it to the higher education level. And so people with higher education have access to the rest of society only by talking to them. And besides, France at that time was divided, but not fragmented, not yet. That is to say, there was a Catholic people on the periphery of France who had their elites, their middle classes, their working classes. And then there was the communist people who had their elites. Very quickly, it was the école normale supérieure. They were elites after all. It's middle class and it's popular class. Many of the workers there were communist peasants on the northwestern edge of the Massif Centrals, so there were complete pyramids, etc. And then the development of higher education has re-stratified society. That is to say, it has created a certain part of the population, people who remained at the primary and secondary education levels. And then there was the category of the population that included those who had gone on to higher education. So at first it seemed, of course, to be a continuation of progress. But in fact, little by little, the number of people with higher education increased, creating a superior group that could exist on its own and begin to think of itself as superior and become culturally self-sufficient. When you have generations where between 40% and 50% of people have higher education,
With the devaluation of higher education as well.
it is the paradox that is, there have never been so many people who have higher education, but the level is falling. So actually there's a kind of disconnection also from studies and real intelligence, and higher education has become like a kind of title of nobility that tells you that you belong to a higher group, even if it's no longer worth anything. So I must say that artificial intelligence is not going to fix things, rather it will solve the question, because I have seen the productions of ChatGPT. It's very superior to the copies of the state of my time. So ultimately, it will result in a clean sweep. So this push forward in higher education caused old Catholic, communist, Gaullist, nationalist, and other ideologies to explode. This fragmented society, which then became vertically stratified as a result. But nowadays, what once existed no longer exists, namely a France that was divided, but divided into groups, which used to function each as an entire society unto itself, complete with its own elites. So now, instead, we have the higher educated groups who think in a certain way, and then we have the people who don't have a higher education. There is also a lot of downgrade among these people. So yes, it is a dynamic. It does not end. So the beginning, the first thing we saw back then was it is rather the downgrading of people at the bottom of the social hierarchy, that is, individuals who did not attend secondary or higher education. So basically, workers and some employees. These are the people who have been designated either directly by economic inequality or indirectly through subconscious inequality as victims through the adoption of free trade. So on top of that, we ruined their work. And at that point, there was a time when higher education was a good form of protection. That is, when we did higher education, but I'm talking about France here. I could talk about the United States, about everywhere, really more or less everywhere. And people used to feel protected. And then inflation continued. And at the current stage, higher education is no longer a real protection. Well, of all opinion pollsters, I'm talking about any country. This is an analysis that would hold true for Russia and soon for China. As for Japan, well, conducting socio-professional educational opinion polls may be an insult to the ideal of Japanese homogeneity, but I've never been able to put Japanese opinion polls on it. That is the best explanation. So you see, for example, the RN's electorate is overwhelmingly made up of people who have not had much education, while the LFI's electorate is, on the contrary, much more highly educated. LFI executives.
But these are people who do not necessarily have the remuneration afterwards who should correspond to their name.
The electorate of the central bloc is the plutocracy, the upper administration, and the old people. It's true, the three blocks are quite simple. In fact, it's becoming quite relaxing to do political science now. But it's true that it's the comparison or the relationship, or should I rather say, the non-relationship between the RN and LFI. That is very interesting because, you see, LFI's voters are no richer than those of the National Rally. So, by caricaturizing, we are putting ourselves back before the recent push to re-denounce the rich of air, to reject this French egalitarianism that does not want to die. So you have the people, the directors of the National Rally, who fear superior to the children of immigrants. Inequalities values, yes, which works the stratified society, and then, but LFI voters, I apologize for saying this. I usually vote for the New Popular Front, and LFI, you can't change who you are. But in fact, we say to ourselves, yes, LFI, it's going to be the left. It's about equality. It's about contestation and protests. It's the identification with the humble and the poor. It's Palestinian flags as well. The revolution from the comfort of your couch, etc. But in fact, what I always feel about the people at LFI is extraordinary class racism. When the deputies of LFI refuse to shake hands with the deputies of the RN, and in fact, I see it in the purity that of the left from LFI in its relations with the National Rally. I'm sorry, I use the concept of the unconscious a lot. I believe in the existence of the unconscious. And I say in this context of impoverishment, a way of feeling superior, not to immigrants, but to French speakers. So in fact, the LFI is just as much as the National Rally worked by this unequal subconscious produced by cultural stratification.
We find the cap of contempt again.
Absolutely. That's what I described in the class struggles in France in the 21st century, this kind of cascade of contempt for descendants. But I would say that the problem with LFI and the problem with the National Rally is that both must also manage the reality of the French egalitarian tradition. In other words, it's not going to be enough. It's always the same thing. You know, if we really think about it, we're ultimately all waiting for the final judgment. I mean, at some point, the RN and LFI will inevitably be confronted with their own internal contradictions. And when that moment comes, they'll be forced to take a clear position on the question of traditional French egalitarianism.
We have to get out of ambiguity.
At the moment, at the end of summer, we're just reacting to the current context, and I'm pretty annoyed. Deep down, I don't care about the National Rally. They're not people from my area. It's always the same. I'm actually pretty annoyed with LFI. Is to say, it's a
It's
how to say, the real one. I've been taking them more seriously since I read Turchin, by the way, strangely enough. So something important, because these innumerable frustrated graduates, as I was talking about, this is the future society as much as the impoverishment of the working class. But I think that this is the real base, in fact, in France. However, and that is something that happened very recently since the law against separatism, in fact, the way they have used the theme of Palestinian solidarity and similar causes, this sort of thing, in order to take control of the Muslim electorate living in the suburbs, while also having no Muslim elected officials. Well, it's not the English Labour Party, it's not communitarianism. No, it's actually people who use the Muslim electorate, who are people who are victimized, persecuted, or ostracized, or whatever, to their own advantage as a kind of massive maneuver that gives them stable constituencies. But the elected officials are just a bunch of little white folks, petty bourgeois, as white as it gets.
Well, in their defense, the other parties didn't exactly rush to fill this niche. In doing so, they also assimilated the defense of Palestine to a very communitarian position in the end.
Yes, but there is no communitarianism in France. That's not true. There are problems. There are groups that are rejected or on the margins. But communitarianism is England. It is expressed by masses of deputies of all colors who actually represent the community, a real political power of Islam within the institutions themselves. In France, there is absolutely none of this. There is a Muslim electorate who actually, as Foucault has shown, has a specific behavior that has in fact shown over time to be very unstable. It was mainly Macronist before turning into Melanchonist, etc. However, there is no communitarianism here. So I would still like to take advantage of the show to say something that is not really relevant, since I am annoyed by Leffy. I remember having at one time, I think I said that at Beria, for elucidate was at the time when everyone accused Leffy of anti-Semitism precisely because of their pro-Palestinian position. And I had this sentence, a superb generosity. So there during the anti-Semitism, my Jewish half-brother rises within me. I said superbly, no, all these are not serious, sure. There are guys who said stupid things, but if the Wehrmacht came back to Paris, I would rather go hide with an Alafi activist rather than with a guy from the National Rally. Since I saw Hanuna's photo, since I read a few quotations from Sophia Chikuru, that's what she's called, in this book, La Mute, about how LFI works. It was certainly written by journalists from Le Monde and Libé, but I checked its quality by the judgment of a good political scientist who must be called Rémi Lefebvre. I saw a few quotations from Sophia Chihiro, so, well, yes, there is in fact an anti-Semitism. I won't say that anymore. I no longer know where I would go to hide. Still not at the National Rally, certainly not with the Macronists. I think I'll just head straight to Italy at this point. More shall I say a kind little word for me, but now I don't want that kind of word anymore. There is indeed anti-Semitism on the left. I have no problem admitting that now. Unfortunately, we have to deal with this. We have to take it into account. It is not the only anti-Semitism there is, but it indeed exists.
Perhaps we will expand a little bit to the international situation because we are also going to do a small summary of what happened this summer at that time with news that was very much dominated by the influence of the United States. So there was the G7 summit on June 17, where the United States rejected the 15% multinational floor tax. He said that they would not pay it and that it was very good if others paid it, but not them. On 25 June, a NATO summit at which was decided that European economies should invest 5% of their GDP in armaments. There's obviously an openness, including calls to arms from the United States. I would also refer you to the excellent investigation by Fréquences Populaires into NATO's procurement agency. We'll put the link in the video, but it's quite edifying. Additionally, more investments in arms, in fact, in American weapons. On 27 July, we had a magnificent international trade agreement that was signed between the United States and the European Union, which results in 15% in customs duties for the European Union against nothing on the American side, with also 600 billion in investments that Europeans must make in the United States and 800 billion in energy purchases. So propose a new concept. It's no longer free trade, it's serf trade. Like the serfs of the Middle Ages, because it's completely unequal. On August 15, we had the meeting in Alaska between the United States and Russia without the Europeans, who were not even invited. On 18 August, they caught up with a visit by Europeans, lined up neatly to the United States at the White House, where they were confirmed that it will be the European Union that will pay for American weapons, who will have to pay an additional 100 billion. I think that if there had been a small gauge this summer that filled up with the fears that the European Union had to pay, it was gradually rising. On September 1, an interview with Ursula von der Leyen at the Financial Times, who announced that they were going to send European troops to Ukraine, followed by a denial from Germany, who said that it was not her place to announce things like that. Then on 4 September, there was the meeting of the coalition of volunteers, Europeans wanting to continue the Ukrainian conflict that implores the support of the United States. And on September 10, Ursula von der Leyen's State of Union speech. I also recommend Francois Cox's video, who analyzed this speech and which announces the continuation of federalization. So that's pretty much how this summer has been going.
In fact, when you look at the whole sequence of events, it seems like madness. Honestly, I think that.
Hence your bad summer.
Hence my bad summer indeed. As I said when I'm on the road, I listen to laughter and songs. I've already said that. When I'm at home in Brittany, I watch LCI for fun. But it's even funnier. But now, really, I had I had a moment of despair because, nevertheless, I am not a revolutionary. I am not a populist. I was born in the intellectual establishment. And as I said, laughing, I want to die in the intellectual establishment. And I was preparing myself, seeing all my predictions come true when it comes to my theory on the subject of the defeat of the West.
Even before the English translation, that was announced.
No, we'll see if it exists. We'll see. Well, maybe we'll see if they see the contract through to the end. As for me, well, I was preparing to re-enter the system of interpreting events magnanimously, modestly, and compassionately, of course, per usual, for all the people who had made mistakes.
And so I thought that my merits were going to be recognized and that we were going to see that after all, I was an ordinary guy, that there were sciences po studies at Cambridge, and that I was a voyeur, a quiet bourgeois. And I saw, in fact, Europeans, like everyone else, spiral out of control in increased Russophobia. And especially in the comments I saw, I'm quoting LCI because they're the worst. But honestly, BFM TV, well, it's not better, and the other newspapers are no better, but getting out of reality. In other words, for me, the most extraordinary example of getting out of reality was this debate. Well, the war is lost, everyone knows it, and the Americans know it. The real difference, as I said, between the Americans and the Europeans is that the Americans really managed this war. It was really the Pentagon had made the plans for the Ukrainian counteroffensive. They know that the war is lost. They know that they no longer have the material resources to produce military goods. And even when they require Europeans to buy military goods at home, they themselves know that they are not capable of producing them. So now we're entering but it makes it possible to pass the hot potato. Maybe we're going to pay, but in fact, we'll be.
That's what I was almost because we'll have them.
Honestly, I'm very, very careful with Americans because now I sometimes give paid conferences. And honestly, the only ones to get paid for in my career. Well, I had some small problems with Dutch people who are very tight with their money, but I think that, as far as I remember, I managed to do it. But I did something for the Center for Advanced Studies at Princeton as well. Princeton I have model to have never been able to get paid. Or they were saying, no, there are problems if you want. It was well paid, huh? It was $5,000. It was good, right? Good. And they were saying things like, no, because you're not a thingy. Well, listen, if you want, so we have found a solution. You can be paid $1,000 per year for 5 years. I said in more correct English, basically, I said in essence, fuck off. So all the stories for me, all the people who deal with Americans are putting themselves in great danger. I would say financial. At least the Americans know that they lost the war, and we can explain, I hope we'll talk about it, Trump's behavior besides that. But Europeans don't know they lost the war because they weren't in the operational command of things, because they're not the producers of the most essential armaments. But this is in they should be aware that they are the biggest losers in the war. As has been said, sanctions actually destroy the European economy while also boosting the Russian economy. There is, in fact, no Russian threat to Europe. The Russians are super happy to be rid of the Poles. There is a slight ambiguity about the Baltic countries, especially since the Baltic countries are really unbearable. I recognize that Estonia may have reason to be worried after the Russian victory in Ukraine. But the idea of expansion, the idea that Ukraine is Europe's defense border, however, that is what we hear. And then the peak of delirium, because when I was young, I was still not very well on my skin and I read a lot of psychiatry. So I go back to the idea of delirium. We were hearing the guys saying, well then, what we're going to do, the coalition of the willing. The coalition of the will, well, we're going to send troops to Ukraine. Troops that we don't have, by the way, but we say we're going to send them anyways.
Which is why the Russians did what they did.
Yes, exactly. That is to say, Putin literally announces, we will never tolerate the presence of NATO in any form whatsoever, European or otherwise, in Ukraine. You're war. So NATO is silently settling in Ukraine. Putin then does what he announced. He's going to war. He is winning his war. He won. And the Europeans did not go to war, but who still lost it, economically say, well, because we lost the war, so now we will succeed in imposing our conditions, but they are crazy. We are dealing with madmen, and this is not just about politics. Honestly, my father was a very great journalist, and seeing journalists or commentators on set, I don't know how he pretend or who entered this parallel reality. It's really just outrageous. That is to say, it's as if all the notions of truth, honor, reflection, I mentioned it's more a decadence. It's about intellectual and moral degeneration. It's really very strong, so I was very disappointed. And that's what I would say is necessary to understand. So I still try during the summer to build a small model of what's going on. Are you interested? Of course. There you go. And I think all listeners too. There you go. Well, actually, so that's going to go back to what you were saying about asymmetric agreements. And it's actually, I think, so the Americans have a fundamental contradiction to be resolved. Well, Trump didn't want this war. Well, you see, he speaks with the Russians kindly. He would like to negotiate with the Russians. I think ultimately the fundamental reason why for Trump Russians are human beings is that in the Trump movement there is a big anti-black racial dimension, and they say to themselves, now the Russians are white, they are people like us. I'm sorry, it's hard to verify or prove, but I personally believe there's something like that and here. And so if with that, he would stop the war. But the problem is because it's a defeat like no other. The Russians showed that they were able to stand up to the whole West. They became the shield. All the rest of the world who is fed up with American financial supervision, the exploitation of working populations in the rest of the world by Westerners, and that the admission of defeat will not just evacuate Ukraine, stop supporting them. They continued to support them. They continued to support them, intelligence, etc. They did not come out of the American war, whatever one may say. And I mean, it wouldn't be Afghanistan, it wouldn't be the exit from Iraq, etc. That would be the first defeat. America's major strategic position is history, and with what lies ahead in the financial empowerment of the BRICS, etc., that would be the end of American imperium. And, well, I said, Trump came because of the American defeat. He's going to have to deal with American defeat, and it's something that is going to be very difficult. It's up to him to accept it and get out of it. But on the other hand, they are irreconcilable contradictions. So we cannot make a complete model of them. Americans themselves don't know what to do. They don't know what to do. Nevertheless, I found an inspiration for President Trump.
An inspiration?
Yes, you see. Perhaps it will surprise you. Was President Henri stood out, who was a good guy, in fact, who did great things for electrification in the agriculture sector, but who had an ironic vision of politics.
He's strongly opposed de Gaulle's return, I believe.
I see you know French politics much better than I do. That's very clear. So, in fact, as you will see, hearing President Quir's grand statements, you'll get the impression that they were made by Trump, because everyone is saying, but Trump says one thing and then his opposite, and then we don't know where he's going. It's complicated. So, Trump Quir, if you will, there is no problem that the absence of a solution does not end up overcoming. It is magnificent. First rule. Second rule, when you are in trouble, muddle everything up. Third rule, politics is not about solving problems, it's about silencing those who pose them. So now we have an authentic reading, but good anyway, not to tell you seriously, but to see in practice what all this means. I think that the Americans have given up containing Russia deep within themselves, have won the control of Ukraine. They will accept that the Russians go as far as Odessa.
Maybe they'll try to get the best out of it for them.
Worse than that, you will see. You are right, but what I'm about to say is going to be even worse. I think I had read what was coming out, so I'm sorry to have lost the reference, but I had read things related to Elbridge Colby, who is Undersecretary of Defense, who is very anti-Chinese and also intelligent, which is something I wouldn't say about his boss, Pete Hegseth. This is a guy who, for example, in his book, The Strategy of Denial, said that in order to prevent hegemony, China in Asia, ultimately, if we couldn't achieve this, we would have to accept that South Korea and Japan would possess nuclear weapons and to no longer be sensitive to Chinese pressures. So he's a creative guy. I'm known in Japan as the guy who says Japan should have nuclear weapons. So see, this boy has my full sympathy. But lately, people were saying that Americans were in. First of all, it's not just that they lost the war against Russia, it's that they lost it against the BRICS, of course, but they especially lost against China. I mean, the China that they actually gave up on. Because China, how to say that? There is already the fact that Chinese naval production will soon make the American Navy look like a dwarf navy. There is the fact that the aircraft carriers are no longer operational in the face of hypersonic missiles. And there is also, of course, the fact that China has put the Americans under embargo for the export of samarium. That is to say, this rare earth that is essential for the manufacture of certain magnets resistant to the heat forces that are needed in the aeronautical and space fields. And the Americans, there is still this culture of talking about reality or discussing it. So I think they gave up. So look, try to imagine a world where deep down inside, well, one of the things that infuriates my wife is when I refer to the concept of the unconscious, because she believes that it can basically make anyone say anything. But let us speculate for an instant on the existence of an American unconscious, an unconscious that would have accepted defeat, not only in the face of Russia, but also in the face of China, which is coming the shock of its inability to control India.
Yes, we saw that indeed. Well done, Trump. So welcome. Maybe not. So 50% tariffs if they continue to buy Russian oil. And India has been doing a lot lately. There was the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. There was a photo that showed Putin with Xi Jinping and Modi together. That's it, which is a bit, I think this says a lot.
Well, it's a photo that will be in history books later on. I have no doubts about that. We have the photos of Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin in Yalta. Well, we will also have the photos of these three together in Dockwell. Don't know where exactly that was, where they met. So, well, the Americans gave up the idea of controlling the entire world by themselves, that's for sure. However, this does not mean giving up all control. What do the Americans actually still control? Yes, plain simple. And, well, right now, they are retreating in South America as well. They are losing Latin America since Brazil is part of the BRICS. You see, we also saw that Bolsonaro was recently condemned as an American agent Exactly. And here, all of the 50% tariffs in Brazil is not eating up, but in all the other more Spanish-speaking countries, China is in the process of becoming the trading partner. In Africa, it is South Africa, a member of the BRICS, that is in conflict with the United States since Trump wanted to welcome all white refugees, but Africa itself is in the process of moving into the Chinese economic trend. The Chinese produce. They produce goods. The others want that dollar, and they need to sell their production too. That's it. To sell their production, they need raw materials. So there is a world that wanders around. So what do they control? They still control East Asia with Japan and Middle Korea, with Taiwan, and then Europe with Germany at the heart of Europe. I think it is the kind of control that I already talked to you about it. Canada, too. Yes, of course, Canada, Mexico. I think I already talked about Amazon's presence in the world, that we live as a natural modernity. And there's a great paper in The Economist, which is overall wrong, but it has lots of good and accurate articles. We showed that Amazon's space of dominance was a space of American political military dominance. But outside of this space, in India and South America, Amazon was not at all a monopoly like we got back home. But local competitors are already well established because there is no control. And I think that's how you should read trade negotiations between Europe and the United States. So if we are in a book on economics, on the theory of international trade, what has just happened does not exist. That is to say, it is unheard of for a country to remove tariff barriers of 15%. And for the other side to say, thank you, Mom, we got ourselves a great deal. But in fact, for example, if you think about it, the United Kingdom had better.
They only have 10%.
10%, that's it. But if.
And the United States asked that Europe also tax and remove big barriers against China and Indochina.
There you go. Okay, and all that. If we are in a book about international codes, all of that is not possible at all. If you think back to the colonial history of Europe, you think of the link between the United Kingdom and its most beautiful colony, which was India. Well, India had to open up to English textile exports from Lancashire. It ruined its traditional local crafts, and India did not negotiate with the English. The English were in power. The British were in power. Well, we are the same. The power is the Americans in Europe. NATO is a grip that can do nothing against Russia, which was defeated by Russia. There is still a grip on Europe. So, in fact, it's not what we have with the United States. It's not business negotiations at all. It is, in fact, an assertion of the political capacity and military capacity of the United States to control not the countries, but the elites and the European, German, French, British elites and decision makers. So, and the real risk. In your book, The Defeat of the West, you said they were all spied on by the NSA and all that. Yes, there is an NSA center in Copenhagen. There is the Ramstein base in Germany. I felt for America, when I went to Germany for the release of my book, I truly felt that political control. We know very well, this is common knowledge, that BND, the German services, are completely in symbiosis with the American intelligence services. So I would say that's what we're up against. And I think that European peoples who are very quickly preparing to despise their leaders, their elites, etc., completely underestimate the magnitude of the danger and the reality of their situation. In fact, we well know that the European idea is dead. We know very well that our political systems are stuck. we know that our societies are on the verge of imploding. But I don't know if people realize that we're American colonies and that there is a problem. And then I would say there, I had an ultimate dream. I took the liberty of it. The idea came to me because people were accusing me of being a Kremlin agent. I said to myself, what would I do if I really were a Kremlin agent? I said to myself, well, I'm going to develop a classical argument in international politics. Then to say that this policy of NATO against Russia has brought a disaster for Europe. We are really under the recovery of the Americans through their financial network, their control of the European banking system, and overall our lack of digital autonomy, in fact. And I said to myself, let's go all the way. We're never going to get out, so now I'm comfortable. Trying to imagine an image where I would become the absolute negative of the LCI comedians. And instead of speculating about a Russian threat,
Tanks. I think in minds, if Russian tanks arrived in Paris, I would be appointed governor of the Finistère region. So yeah, I'm a Russian agent for laughs, and I say to myself, well, no, the way out of this, given the weight of the American stranglehold on our earthly celebrities, is to get out with the help of the Russians, with the help
of the Russians. You see? And since there is no Russian threat, since Russians have sovereignty, it is their obsession, military, economic, digital sovereignty. Well, we are going to ask the Russians to help us get out of the American grip. And I thought that, and immediately, I was frightened because I said to myself, but in fact, perhaps what is currently brewing between Trump and Putin, well, it's simply that Putin, the Russians have started to despise Europeans in a way that they deserve. They reoriented their economy elsewhere. And maybe the deal is going to be, well, you Americans, you leave Ukraine to us, but we leave you with the complete domination of Germany, that is to say, of Western Europe. And that's a real risk. No? Doesn't that scare you? It's terrifying. That is, maybe the Russians are not interested. They're not interested at all anymore in the Europeans who are prepared to leave them in the hands of the Americans.
That is to say, as the continent becomes poorer and is exploited for hundreds of billions, it will also become less and less interesting.
It's a deal. I mean, it's the goal of the Russians. So I couldn't really put Poland into the model. Perhaps all of Eastern Europe will regain its role of no man's land with Western Europe that has become an American colony. Well, and Ukraine, which has become then, knows partly all the way to the Dnieper, a colony of Russia.
In any case, we can see that the European Union seems to be intensifying its control precisely on digital tools. That's it. Between the DSA, there was the control chat initiative, which for the moment has not happened, but which may still be in the works, and in particular at the initiative of France, which consists in monitoring, in fact, all messages on phones and computers, in fact, before they are sent, in fact. We can see that in Moldavia and in Romania, there are lawsuits against candidates who were against European candidates that took place. They are accused of being pro-Russian and all that, and behold, we can see that there is tension anyway.
Yes, there is a tension, but this is where the analysis of the situation becomes very difficult. It is that people are lost. The dominant ones are lost. In fact, it is a kind of crisis.
A flank forward a bit.
I would say a flight in all directions is a kind of leap, a run for your life situation. So there are some who will say to themselves, there is a need for more totalitarian control of communication instruments in Europe, and who accept, or who did not understand, who accept or who have not understood, not to accept or not to understand, the idea that we are in American hands and that the aim of the Americans is no longer to control Russia, China, etc. Controlling them is hard to accept. I am having trouble.
All networks are, in fact, American.
But not in Russia, not in Iran, not in Saudi Arabia, not in the rest of the world. Maybe we're just becoming the last colony in the American system. We were the first with Japan, finally the Second World War.
And maybe we are in the process of regaining that kind of status. These are very frightening prospects because, in addition, I seem to speak as if the objectives of control, power, and exploitation were reasonable or rational. And it is true that the United States, which no longer produces much, has an interest in plundering wealth. Yes, but neither are we, in fact. We don't produce much anymore either. No, Germany, a little bit more. Yes, Germany does produce.
We'll try to take the cutting edge domains. The last areas, the areas that are supposed to preserve Americans' primacy, artificial intelligence. I was saying earlier how much I appreciated it for replacing what has already replaced the National School of Administration. There you go. How to say the conception of things stays in America. The programs, the plans, even the plans for semiconductors. I am not an expert in these issues, but the manufacturing of all this is done in Taiwan or possibly in Korea as well. The Japanese would be able to get back in there too with Chinese engineers. So there's the thing, the hyper-efficient company that manufactures stuff, ultraviolet tech, and this sort of things is in the Netherlands, near Eindhoven. And so the Americans are not capable of manufacturing. At first glance, we could say that Americans are incapable of manufacturing what they design themselves. But when you look at who designs these things in the United States, well, those who do it, they are Americans of a slightly special kind. That is to say, the CEO of NVIDIA is of Taiwanese origin. And NVIDIA employees, more than half are of Indian origin. That is people who have a cultural relationship with major strategic rivals. It must be put in counterpoint to the Putin response, to the Putin-Shimori meeting. And so it's not fair that it's not even worth questioning the American loyalty of its employees. That means maybe it explains the certain feeling of renunciation that is palpable here. That is to say that the United States must develop a cultural inferiority complex compared to Asians, whether it's Indians or Chinese or Korean or Japanese. Honestly, I'm often accused of being anti-American. Well,
See.
it's not that I think it's true. I think it's worse. That is to say, I think I have become Americanophobic. That is to say, I think that a monster society is emerging, a world in absolute degeneration, which is fracturing internally. And most of all, I believe America is this country that makes people stupid. In other words, you can clearly see the immigrants coming. Bright, dynamic, and their children are becoming stupid Americans. And so I think when you tell people that they're going to make money in the United States, that's possible since we're near the dollar pump. But the price you have to pay is that we're going to have stupid kids. But beyond these rational goals, There is, as I mentioned, in the festivals of the West, there is the loss of religious meaning, the loss of a sense of values, nihilism. Il noite towards the Dutch mid-Euros at fall, amid this atmosphere of imperial decline and the decline of power, even if there was a certain tendency to fall back on its nearby colonies, on its nearby foreigners, as the Russians would have said of their equivalent, there was also a kind of nihilistic impulse, a kind of violence, a kind of nihilistic impulse, a kind of violence, a kind of death drive nonetheless. I'm sorry to say, I am completely obsessed with the issue of evil, the return of evil in the world, and in international politics, and in the internal life of nations. But in America right now, there is a pleasure in killing. Sally?
There are aggressions against other countries. We have seen Venezuela and everywhere. Yes, that's it.
Internally, there would have been the last assassination, but externally,
There have been 2 assassinations which were also captured live on video on social media. We are witnessing a fracture. When we talk about fracture, we really see American society on the brink of civil war, it seems, because there are people who are actually rejoicing over the assassinations. We have heard it.
there I was talking about the return of the word oligarchy in the vocabulary of the National Rally. But what is emerging in the Anglo-American world now is the concept of civil war. There was this article from the academic at King's College London who was called Betts, I think, who put the civil war, yes, the concept of civil war. It's appearing in the United States. It's appearing everywhere. For me, when I try to come up with a general model of what is happening, I see a West that is locked in on itself, who is fracturing between states. So the divide between the United States and Europe, with the United States against Europe. And then you also have internal divide within Europe, and that divide within Europe, and that divide would be, I would say, is continuing or continues within a state.
With a class struggle, maybe?
That's it. And it's a fracturing, how to say, hierarchical or hierarchical, that is, in fact, what I'm doing, I am trying to, even succeeding, to expand the model of class struggles in France in the 19th century, which was the internal analysis is French. So I had the defiance of the state-financial aristocracy for the educated middle classes, the contempt of the educated middle classes for the educated middle classes, the contempt of the educated middle classes for the voters of the National Rally, the contempt of the voters of the National Rally for children of immigrants. Yes, that's it. The cascade of contempt. It also works internationally. That's it. And so you have, so now our financial aristocracy was stuck because it can't do anything in Europe. It's stuck. But now we have the Western world is blocked because Russia has closed the world to Western power. And therefore, the Americans cascades and contemptuous attitudes are taking revenge on Europeans and primarily on Germans who have effectively controlled Europe since the financial crisis of 2007-2008.
There is an outstream anyway.
Yes, but they obey. On the other hand, when I see Walter Young, for example, who is now positioned to succeed in the Tour de Force, not the Tour de Force, it is only natural to be on the right of the RN, because he does not have the problem of an egalitarian electorate. As much as 80 immigrants and who launched us not so long ago into a conflict with Algeria. Was completely obsessed with Algeria, but it was a stunt. Algeria is an adversary in our measure. That's it. But what's really completely nerve-wracking about this model is just that, so what's the saying?
Ici, c'est Germany, that is to say, Germany. Well, who drank its feet under Olaf Scholz, who did not dare to say that the Americans had broken the gas pipeline or the Russian gas pipeline, but who dragged his feet was therefore replaced by Friedrich Merz, which is in fact very worrying. That's actually the mistake in my book. I know, but in fact, I was hoping for things from Germany. But in fact, all my mistakes, they say that I'm Germanophobic. But all my prediction mistakes, it's when I hoped to be in Germany. So after the empire, I was hoping for Germany to emancipate itself from the United States to make Europe. No, it was just to enter a European hierarchical model and dominate it by seeing the French piss off and then sending the United States off in this phase of history. And here I was hoping for a Germany whose opposition to the war, which is destroying its industry, which is really not doing well, would lead it to react. In fact, exactly the opposite is happening. That is to say, a kind of rise in Russophobia, hijacking, etc. But since we will not dare to wage war on the Russians, as we will simply have to admit it between parties, and if we enter, what will be the contempt for the 100 names for Germans? Who is going to be the target? France. Well, are you coming in the second week on Julian Lepers? There is actually a historical precedent. There you go. And so, in fact, this Germany that had hitherto been so tolerant of our excesses could simply, by a kind of natural reflex, be humiliated by the United States and accepted its humiliation, make us feel on the floor below that we are not much. You see, we have the debt issue. That's it. I am not sure. I don't see it being used against me as an analytical error later on. Surely this is what happened during the Greek crisis, which happened 10 years ago. I think this is not a time to dare to be prejudiced. But Germany, in fact, Germany really means a lot to me. That's the problem. They're in a recession, and that's 125,000 industrial jobs destroyed, mainly in the automotive industry, because in fact, without energy, there is a lot of relocation of German companies to the United States.
The funny thing is that it was also the driving force behind the whole European Union. The deal until then was that we lost the factories, but they exported.
And that was a bit like that. On the other hand, there was something that I could not solve. I was saying to myself, well, then we are going to be bled by the United States. That is to say, they are going to come up again. No, in fact, it's going to be a lot easier than that. We are going to get destroyed. That's not going to allow the Americans to pull themselves together. In other words, they will destroy European industry, but they will not be able to rebuild theirs because they do not have the qualified population. Moreover, whenever there are investments, that's when I think back to my Princeton conference. That is to say, they don't have, in addition to our internal contradictions. I think of the story of, since they don't have the skilled population, when they demand Asian investment, inevitably there are Asian workers who are being imported at full speed to do what the Americans are not capable of doing. And then there was the story of you're not capable of doing. Then there was the story about when Trump sent his integration controllers in a new factory. I don't know if it's in Georgia or elsewhere, who had to be quickly repatriated. And so there, the obsession with American immigration becomes antagonistic to the reindustrialization project. The classical theory of protectionism that was developed by Friedrich List, even in the first half of the 19th century in Germany, There was protectionism as we protect ourselves in terms of imports of goods, but we have the freedom of movement of capital to attract capital home and the freedom of movement of labor in order to attract qualified labor to home. And the Americans did not have to choose. But again, the multiplicity of plans, the multiplicity of contradictions, I'm not going to start pretending like, well, I think that the difficulty I have, the trouble I'm having modeling the whole thing. I think my last book showed that I was not the worst in terms of analysis. And really, I'm having a hard time. And I tell myself that the others must be struggling too. In other words, it must be complicated in the minds of people who advise. I can't imagine what's in the minds of other men. But in the people who advise them, I don't know what's going to happen. I read the paper by Stéphane Meron, who is supposed to be his advisor, his economic guru, who was very aware of the contradiction that exists between the commercial tariff policy to reindustrialize and the hegemonic situation of the dollar. I say hegemonic, but in fact it is no longer so hegemonic. I mean the situation of the dollar as a reserve currency, because that's what I was telling you in the effect of the West. The real competitor of American industry is not even European industry, it is the production of dollars. If you can make money by printing metaphorically, why bother training engineers? It's much easier, after all, to train lawyers and financiers. Beyond, he's aware of that. He suggests a narrow way to resolve the contradiction, but no, it will not be resolved. It's not worth a dime, as they used to say in my day.
That's it.
Hence these attacks then. Because as we can see, this not new now, this escape, so to speak, that takes the form of attacks on other countries.
Yes, exactly, that's it. In fact, what I personally think is that I'm starting to really feel worried on a moral level. In fact, it's not well. In my line of work, I always try to stick to cold analysis. Well, I can, of course, introduce the concept of religion, zero, to explain the emergence of nihilism. But I personally find it a little difficult to follow through with this idea and talk about an international state of affairs, which would be driven by the emergence of evil. I mean, wouldn't I be aligning myself with Iranian concepts? Yes, the great Satan. The great Satan, that's it.
Or the concepts, those Bush's concept, in fact.
Yes, the axis of evil. However, it takes one to know one. Haha, that's right. It takes one to know one, literally. If you have these ideas in mind, that means you do have them in mind. And so now, obviously, with my personal little wanderings, it's just a so much spiraling into hostility towards Russia. So I am about to accept the concepts of Iran, of the great American Satan, of the little Israeli Satan. We're going to have to talk about that.
We can talk about it.
And then the return of the old German Satan.
Oh, yes, the old Satan.
Yes, because there has recently been an attack by Israel on Qatar, which then led to the formation of a mutual defense alliance between Pakistan and Saudi Arabia. We can see that this reconfiguring the whole architecture, where Saudi Arabia previously relied heavily on the United States. We feel that there is a bit of concern, even if it comes from Israel and not from the United States.
Sorry, may I stop you? I have a personal wandering to do. Well, it's not a wandering, it's a very important point of analysis. And now I think that this is the subject on which I am most in head-on collision with everyone, including with my idol Mesheimer. It is the decision-making relationship between Israel and the United States. Most people give Israel decision-making autonomy and even the ability to decide for the United States.
Through lobbies as well.
Through the lobby. Mesheimer had written a book on the Israeli lobby with his friend Walt, which is very good. I read it. I have it in Brittany somewhere. But I don't believe that at all. That is to say, there is obviously a pathological dynamic of the Israeli society. I agree with that. But how can I say that this pathological dynamic has been stimulated, brought under control, and aggravated by the pathological dynamics of the American system? That is to say, really, to understand what is happening, you have to make the hypothesis.
Money and weapons too.
Well, then they decide, but we have to go further. And it is not that they provide the armament. This is a hypothesis that I propose to all serious geopoliticians, who, as we know, there are millions on Earth. And so, in fact, everything is decided in Washington. All of it is decided in Washington. The attack on Iran was decided in Washington, and the attack on Qatar as well was decided in Washington. There is an American military base there. I mean, how else could it be? And above everything else, there is a kind of kinship in style that is being established between American military behavior and Israeli military behavior that suggests that these two things are the same now. For example, I was struck to see in succession the destruction of these speedboats leaving Venezuela, and therefore shocked from the outside, and then the attack between Israeli quotation marks on Qatar. That is to say, shooting outside of any conception of international law, but that's what follows. These targeted killings of Iranian scientists, etc. We literally heard Trump say that eliminating Khamenei, the Iranian supreme leader, was a decisive objective. As we can see, they speak the same language.
As he previously did for Soleimani.
Yes, exactly. They are becoming the same thing, and everything is simpler. So, furthermore, it also evokes a, dare I say, completely vicious side of American politics. Because the American discourse, on the one hand, will be a realistic when it says that it is necessary to discuss with the Russians when it must be admitted that the Ukraine war is lost. And even when he admits that it is difficult to get out of the war in Ukraine, because that would be the collapse of the American system. So here we are. But there is a dimension, I would say, a death drive, absolutely. And that turns around against the Allies in this sense, if you accept the idea that the attack on Qatar has been decided by the Americans, you fall well into the model of an America that's turning against its allies. Yes, that's it. So now I have a new question. This is not a prediction, but an inquiry. So I'm stepping into dystopian, to science fiction territory. Please don't act like you're taking me seriously here. I look forward to the first targeted assassination of a European leader who does not do what is asked of him by the Americans.
Yeah.
But are they scared already?
I mean, they're council controlled. Their money, which is at the cradle, is controlled. But what will happen when the American system collapses and when?
Let's not forget the Slovak Prime Minister. There was an assassination attempt against him. I mean, it was not necessarily.
That's it. But now I wasn't accusing anyone. But I mean, it's necessary. What's difficult in the current situation is how to say.
This is what could happen if we ever had one of the leaders in France. Maybe he would be recalcitrant.
That's very good. Thank you for completing. It's,
There you go.
Yes, indeed. It is interesting since it was Max Blumenthal who actually looked a little bit into the past of Donald Trump's chief of staff. And apparently it was a member of Netanyahu's team, in fact, who comes with.
but it's completely interpenetrated. It's a single system. Yes, in fact, it is not in the sense of what you are saying. Yes, it's one system. But what's complicated is the issue of Jewishness in all of this.
Because it's true that there are a lot of billionaires or not billionaires, Jewish extremists of the extreme right in the circle of Netanyahu.
It's also true that Trump, ever since his first term in office, made a very aggressive pro-Israel policy, as far as I remember. He was the one who set up the American embassy in Jerusalem, and in fact, he was the one who
Pushed it all forward. I am convinced that it is.
But on the other hand, there are also all these critical evaluations by Trumpists, hence the majority of American Jews who are not like that.
American Jews, by and large, remain fairly peaceful and reasonable people in the American system. They oppose a lot. That's it. And so there's this regime.
There was even conversation in the magazine, a speaker, influencer, who was apparently assassinated, had taken a stand against Israel. So there were a lot of rumors, all of that. And Netanyahu even denied it by saying that he had nothing to do with it.
There also lies the difficulty of building models. Everyone is lost. Nobody knows what to think.
The younger generation seem to be moving a bit away from the neoconservative model of alignment.
Yes, indeed. But here I was specifically thinking about the problem of American Jews. That is to say, Jews. This is an issue that will be costly for personal reasons. Jews, ultimately. Let's follow this through to its conclusion. Jews who ultimately end up being labeled as anti-Semitic because they are not aligned with Netanyahu. Personally, I knew it was going to come. It came to me through a footnote in a book by Pierre-André Talliet, with whom I was once a friend, and who comes from a Russian family that is quite anti-Semitic, but he himself is a great defender of the Jewish cause and theory, and who, without daring to go directly to it, in another way, suggested that my anti-Americanism, in my memory, I should check. I apologize. I felt indirectly attacked for anti-Semitism, even though I am of Jewish origin. And when I came, I saw a piece of paper, so I don't know. So there was directly attack for racism, anti-Semitism, and my last one, by someone named Olivia Schmidt, who literally works for a university that must be affiliated with NATO somewhere in Denmark. But I could be wrong, but Schmidt doesn't sound like a very Jewish name. It should be checked. If I am not wrong, I am not a specialist when it comes to these issues. But I always felt that there will come a time when we were going to end up putting Jews in camps under the charge of anti-Semitism. But do you understand? I actually feel like it's coming. I would like to talk about Israel.
Indeed. In fact, what we can also see is that there is not such a total delegitimization of the whole West as well, precisely in relation to the situation in Palestine. The double standards that were pointed out in relation to Israel. Well, there you go. It just delegitimizes the whole idea.
It's the end, it's the moral end, it's moral bankruptcy. That is to say, bankruptcy. I really am a Westerner. I have a book coming out in Japan, invented by my brilliant publisher, Nishi. Nishi-san, to be serious. I wrote a big preface, the first words of which were, I am an unhappy Westerner. I am not pretending to be anything else. But I don't know of people. It's true that the Gaza issue, for me, I was quite far away from settling on that.
We are talking about 10% of the population killed or injured. Well, I don't know if people realize
of the moral morality of what it represents. And not just for Jews. So when you are Jewish or Jewish origin, well, then it's utter anguish. But in fact, it is also a question central to humanity. That is to say, the idea that a country that claims to be of the origin of a persecuted people, where there were so many Holocaust survivors, etc., is beginning to engage in behaviors that the United Nations is now describing as genocidal, and with good reason. It's a question about humanity with a capital H. We should have hordes of philosophers trying to ask themselves what that means. So for the Jews, I'm coming.
On the contrary, perhaps proves the universality of evil.
Yes, maybe. That may be one of the conclusions. Indeed, that is probably the conclusion, unfortunately. But personally, I am deeply embarrassed because I used to believe that I was on the side of the good by birthright. I talked about that already, so now I'm going to stop. And now I have all my ancestors who were, in the end, once on the side of good, and who now find themselves on the side. I mean, so, on the side, I would say, of dubious positions. There is one of the things that...
But they had nothing to do with it.
Absolutely. I said earlier that I'm not into this thing anymore, that I was not. Please excuse me if I'm not very coherent, but this really touches my heart. It is clear that I'm in the midst of personal disclosure here. There are times, however, when I am a cold and rational geopolitician. Act simply doesn't work. When it comes to the Jewish question, for me, it's more complicated. I said earlier that I had changed my mind about LFI because I clearly saw its anti-Semitism. Moreover, a rather banal, uninteresting form of anti-Semitism, fueled effectively by Israel's behavior in Gaza, is difficult. For me, what I'm most interested in right now, and for me, the real threat, this is what I call anti-Semitism 2.0. That is, it is the anti-Semitism of people who defend Israel. Because look, you have to use a logic here. Now, that is to say, imagine that you are a Trump supporter. You are a leader of the national rally. You are a right-wing man. So you come from anti-Semitic backgrounds. And then you start to explain that the behavior of the State of Israel and Netanyahu must be supported. That it is acceptable, reasonable, that the massacre of October 7 by Hamas is an inexorable crime that justifies everything.
Maybe it's hard for me to focus. There you go. But at the end of the day, and you say that the people who don't agree with that should be hounded as anti-Semitic. That's what's happening in the United States. That's what's happening in the United States. And in fact, to the extent where the conduct of the state by Netanyahu and of the state of Israel, which is a democracy, being a democracy defines a certain form of collective responsibility. There you go. Insofar as this behavior is indeed monstrous, and Joel suggested that this is normal Jewish behavior, in fact, you define Jews as monstrous. That is, you are taking away the right of Jews to be human beings who are universally generous. So, in fact, it is an anti-Semitism of incredible perversity. That is to say, it's as if these people, for me, are people who, I'm talking about Goyim here, I'm not talking about lost Jews who don't understand what's going on. You see, but here I'm talking about non-Jewish people, actually. And for me, it's as if this world, there you go, this Christian world, who tried to show us, that is to say, the physical extermination of the Jewish people, was involved in a plan of moral extermination. So there you go. I speak from my heart. I need to say it. I don't ask people to join, but I needed to say it.
Perhaps most of all, they're supporting colonialist ventures. And
it is beyond that. It is beyond that because
it's more the fight against Muslims, whom they hate, in fact.
It is true that the detestation of Islam, which is all over Europe, also explains it. That is for sure. Taken into account the intensity and ignominy of what is happening in Gaza, it's no longer enough to explain. I think that in order to support what is happening in Gaza, if you are a Goy, you have to be anti-Semitic.
Or have certain kinds of views. There are also, as always, evangelists who are convinced that the Messiah will return when Israel has a gigantic territory and all that.
And so I define these evangelists as a variety of anti-Semitic Goyim. It is entirely possible. Moreover, when it comes to, you see, I don't really believe in America's rational goals anymore, but I no longer believe in Israel's rational objectives either. It's just, for me, Israel is what we are assessing here. It is devoid of the project, that is to say, it is at the beginning the idea of a refuge state for a persecuted Jewish people. I would say that it was not the only thing that was possible, but it still seemed entirely reasonable. And in the still colonial context of the time, the policy of ethnic suppression carried out by the first state of Israel in Palestine in some regions was not a good thing at all. Of course, however, it was not so much worse than what the French did in Algeria. But here, I think what we are realizing is that in this war, which has no other objective than itself, it is, well, it's a Hebrew state, as they say. No longer has. That it no longer has any awareness of what it is, or that it no longer has a real project. Sometimes it's an illicit one too, but it's an illicit one, yes, but it's on the, how to say, the loss of religious meaning. I'm leaving out the ultra-Orthodox here, but the loss of religious meaning when you are just French and when you're Jewish is just not the same at all. Because there is a definition of France that is not religious. There is a country that has its eyes, that has its landscapes, that has its beauty, that has its history, which for me starts with Francois Villon rather than with Notre Dame de Paris. But everyone has their own preference, but you have that left, if you stop believing. You are in stage 0 after having been in the zombie stage of religion, and if you are Jewish, it is more problematic, since the definition of your being is religious to begin with. So it's really a lot worse, conceptually speaking, but it therefore takes refuge in phantasmagories of retroactive reading of the Bible, which historians have shown was a web of late fabrications. And when I hear Netanyahu say that there will never be 2 states, I feel this instinct going up in me. That is to say, I'm baptized, by the way, so I'm not only Jewish, but in this situation, I feel how could I say that? I already said that before, but here you go. The dream of every little Jewish boy to become a prophet of the Old Testament. And the thing is, what I'm hearing Netanyahu say is that he says that there will never be 2 states in this land of Palestine. I don't know if he says there will be 0 or that there will be 1. There won't be a Jewish state. But I hear him say that the state of Israel will cease to exist one day. In fact, that's what I hear. But from a really religious perspective right now, you see it's really what we need is to understand the enormity. And so when I see Europeans, Macron saying, yes, we are going to recognize a Palestinian state. Honestly, when you see what's going on there, when you see the destruction, etc., when you see what they're actually doing, etc. In other words, many other countries have already done so. Yes, that's true. But in fact, we know very well that it's just talk to ease our conscience if we don't want to be accomplices of the ongoing genocide, well, we should break off our diplomatic relations with Israel at the very least. I mean, that's it. And so people who are, the problem is not, I'm not against the idea of putting Palestinian flags on socialist town halls. I think it's pretty nice. But I'm happy because it would upset LCI. LFI, of course, LCI, they're my 2 pet peeves at the moment, LFI and LCI. Since it's LFI's business, so Olivia Forrest smart and so on. But that's why it's so much. It's so beneath the issue at stake, which is so enormous. It's insane, and it's also because it's so difficult to accept to see the reality of the horror, to accept to see that America is becoming an ignoble country, and that is not going to recover. It will be a post-Trump era, but it will be even worse. That Israel is going to get worse and worse because all the good people are going to leave. I was in my car, then I was coming back from the supermarket in Brittany. And so I was listening to France Info. We do what we can, And a few days ago, I heard a French-speaking Israeli journalist named Daniel Ben-Simon. I think I remember a name like that. It was very moving, who expressed his horror, a completely civilized guy, who obviously spoke on behalf of all Israelis who do not subscribe to this policy.
And in fact, what was extraordinary was that this man managed to, he was really sympathetic in his doubt, and he was saying, he was asking, but why is the United States doing nothing? Why don't they stop it? There was something he said, in essence, there is something we do not understand. What I am saying, what we do not understand is that it is the United States that is in charge, and that it is they who have this genocidal policy, and that they are the ones who contributed to the degeneration of the State of Israel. But
Okay, maybe we'll finish on that, unless you have other things to add.
for me, that's what I would like to finish on, to reach that old problem.
Yes, that's it.
But it's not just the narcissistic thing about the Jewish question. It's just, it's the, in fact, there are two poles in the situation whose relationship is not well understood. There is this West that went and smashed on the Russian wall, and which is internally fractured.
I would like to put back a little bit, because I think that the cover of your book is perfect for this conclusion. I don't know if you can see it.
I never met the guy who did it over at Gallimard, but it was so great.
Frankly, it actually completely anticipated your analysis.
Yes, but that's not me, it's the graphic designer who was great.
It's extraordinary anyway, this fragmentation like that.
And so there's this polarity. There's also something we haven't talked about, is when people, maybe I want to say something about more personal, because we're coming from the end of the story to the last judgment.
That will be for the next episode.
The next episode I will talk about the trial of the guilty.
All right.
So anyway,
At yesterday's demonstration, we saw a guillotine. Let it come out.
very good. As for me, I have other complaints, much more, so much the better. A lot softer. But for example, we are there in our delirium, continuing to say that Putin was a monster. The thing I found to be the funniest of all was Macron saying that Putin was an ogre. He was there, he was betraying his childish nature. I mean, it's the kids who talk about ogres, and so there we saw that Macron was a baby. That is all.
It needs to protect it.
It was you who said it. It was you who said it. But what we can't imagine, it is vision that the rest of the world has of Russia. That is to say, everywhere, all these people who have suffered Western arrogance, the overexploitation of the West in the second globalization, the employment of their working population, etc., and the contempt of Westerners and the arrogance in terms of the values. But I'm sure of it. I don't have any precise data to back this up, but I think that for them, it is the opposite. That is to say, the image of Putin in Russia must be extraordinary. That is to say, they dared. They did. But I had this feeling when I saw Putin appear for these two television appearances that announced the war. And I saw this guy throwing the gauntlet at the West, and he won. So the image of Russians must be quite extraordinary. So, on the one hand, we have this epic dimension. So, on the one hand, we have this epic dimension, which is a dimension.
It's very much military, which we are used to in the history of the world.
A bit like during the Second World War as well.
Yes, exactly. The Russians are suffering, and yet they can't help but say very well from the world.
Kashakelis has engaged in revisionism by saying that it was not Russia that won the Second World War at all. We were very intrigued to know what she meant.
There you go. All of this, it takes us a step towards Western madness. And then there is the other pole of moral collapse in the West, which is this situation in Gaza. It has actually become just as important. That is to say, we let it happen.
We are letting this happen, but we are nothing. Well, I mean, measures such as waving 3 Palestinian flags, or recognizing a second state at a time when the potential citizens of that second state are being freely shot at by the Israeli army are shameful. It's shameful. Yes, exactly. We should understand the concept of shame, of honor, of justice. You said it's a vast program.
We're going to finish up that, and so we'll see you next time for a new episode. Thanks again, Emmanuel Todd. Thanks to everyone who followed this show. Don't forget to comment, thumbs up, and share. It's very important for the channel and for SEO. Thanks, SEO. Thanks a lot to everyone. And until next time.
Thank you, especially for putting up with my terminal ramblings.
It is my pleasure. Thanks. Goodbye.